Well, welcome, Miss Janell. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for coming. We have a lot of book club members who are learning about nature this month. What is a Master Naturalist?
So, as a Master Naturalist, we study plants, animals, birds. Some people are more interested in birds, but not only that, we study how ecosystems work together. For example, we study how the water interacts with the land, which interacts with the air, which then causes certain animals to be at home in that ecosystem, and other animals need to change or adapt because of what's going on in the ecosystem.
Okay. So, I guess could you tell me more about what are the different type of ecosystems?
Yeah, so for example, Louisiana has a great ecosystem all along our coast, and we call that ecosystem the wetlands. So I'm going to show a map of our great state of Louisiana, and you know that if you look down at the very southern edge of Louisiana, all that, basically everything from New Orleans west to the border of Texas, all that is wetlands.
Oh.
And so what makes a wetland is important to us as naturalists. And what makes a wetland are the type of soils that are there, how much water is there, and the type of plants that are there.
Okay.
So I brought some things to show our readers about tools that scientists use to study those three things: soil, plants, and water.
Soil, plants, and water.
Very good, very good. So the first tool is a book that kind of looks like a paint chip, right?
Yes,
right.
yes.
And so as a naturalist, we want to know how the soil in one location is different from the soil in another location. So if you were to go out in your backyard and dig,
Mm-hmm.
it would look different than the soil in my backyard because we don't live in the same place. And so this color scheme gives numbers and letters to help scientists understand the differences in the soil. Okay, so that's a great tool for studying soil. I have a couple of tools for studying water. This is really important. So later we're going to talk about types of marshes. And the big important thing in a marsh, which is important in turn for the plants that are there, is salt.
Mm.
So we want to measure how much salt is in the water. So when you took your coffee this morning or when you drank your bottle of water, did it taste salty to you?
Not this morning.
What if you took a big drink of water and it was salty? What would you do?
I probably just spit it right back out.
Yeah. We don't want salt in our water.
Oh.
Okay, so that's called potable water. The fresh water that comes into our city, we treat and we send it out to the homes, and we want that water to be fresh. Well, plants aren't necessarily like that. Neither are fish and neither are other kinds of animals. They are adapted to live in salt water. And so as a naturalist, we want to know how much salt is there. And so this is a device that we can put a little drop of water on here, look through the lens, and you can tell how much salt is in that swamp or marsh or even your drinking water from this morning.
Oh, wow.
And so that's real important. In general, we want to know things like that because of changes. For example, after hurricanes that come in from the Gulf, so I'll give you a question. Would you think the water in the Gulf is salt water or fresh water?
Salt water.
Yeah, it is. In fact, it's very salty. So all those hurricanes that come in, any kind of tropical storm that pushes from the south up onto the land is going to carry that salty water with it. How long does it stay? I don't know, but this is one way that we can find out. Okay, so this is called a refractometer, and we study the salt water. So I'm going to go get my other tool that we use to study water, and this is called a water clarity tube.
Oh, wow.
So we fill the tube with water, and then we slowly let the water out of the tube. But Chris, if you look down at the bottom of the tube, what do you see down there?
Like a check, like the target.
Yeah. So I'll show this to our audience. There's a black and white target down at the bottom of the tube. So imagine this tube is filled with water. You're going to look down through the top, okay? And I'm going to let the water out of the tube very slowly until you can barely see this black and white target. So if I went outside and I got some water from the ditch, it would be dirty, right? Okay. So technically it's not dirty, it's just full of sediment. But you're looking through the sediment particles down to the black and white disc at the bottom. And when you can see it, you say stop. I stop the water, and that gives us a measurement. So that's an important measurement for our wetlands because this lets us know how much sediment the Mississippi River, for example, is carrying.
And so sediment, what is exactly would be a part of that?
Well, good. That's a great question. Okay. We could do a whole series just on sediment. But for us, for our purposes, why is sediment important for the wetlands? Because that sediment builds the wetlands and it carries nutrients. Okay. So you might have taken a vitamin this morning. I sure did. Okay. And those vitamins have nutrients in them. Our food has nutrients in them. And the sediment carried into the wetlands has nutrients in it. Okay. So the amount of sediment in any given body of water is really important to us. And this is one of the tools that we use to measure it.
Right.
Okay, so we talked about the soil, the water. We didn't talk very much about the plants because I didn't bring any wetland plants, but I have some pictures that we're going to show for some of the wetland plants. So I'm going to ask you a hard question.
Okay.
If you walked into a swamp, what do you think would be the first kind of tree you would expect to see?
Okay. Well, the first type of tree that I would expect to see is...
This is a hard question. Okay,
oh,
so I'm going to show it to the people watching, okay? And they may know what kind of tree that is. Cypress trees.
Cypress. Okay.
So if we walked into a swamp, we would see cypress trees. That's one of the characteristics of a swamp. And the cypress trees are related to our initial three items that we talked about, soil, water, and plants, because cypress trees like water, which is why you've got them planted right outside your building, which is why, you know, we plant them all over the New Orleans area. They're cypress trees because they like water.
Okay.
Okay, so a cypress tree is going to be one of the main plants that we see in a wetland, along with some other trees, but cypress trees are really special for many, many reasons. One of which is that they have unique leaves. And if you could imagine that their leaves are like fingers, when the wind is blowing, the fingers sort of intertwine like this and create more of a mesh that slows the wind as it moves in during a storm. So we'd like to have just millions and millions of cypress trees on our coast with their specially adapted leaves so that the winds that come on shore from storms would decrease somewhat. Does that make sense?
Yes, to help break the wind.
Yeah. And cypress trees have many other adaptations. For example, they have knees. You may have noticed that sometime. And those knees help anchor the tree so that they're not as susceptible to strong winds as other trees are.
So what's the difference between a swamp and a marsh?
Good. That's a great question. So a swamp mainly is going to have trees. That's the primary difference. So here I showed you the picture of the swamp, and now I'm going to show you a picture of, okay, so Chris gets a preview, and then I'm going to turn it. Okay, so what's the difference between the first picture with the cypress trees and this picture?
Not a lot of trees.
No
a
trees.
lot more water.
No trees. There you go. No trees, a lot more water. It's open, and that's the primary difference between a swamp and a marsh. Okay, so once you start driving, let's say you start out in New Orleans and you start driving south, 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 all down the Mississippi River, there are fewer and fewer and fewer trees as you get down the river. Well, at one time there may have been more trees, but now there are fewer and fewer trees because even cypress trees won't tolerate the water that's common closer to the coast. And the part of the water they won't tolerate is the salt in the water. And so that's what makes the marshes change in character as we get down to the coast. Doesn't mean there aren't plants there, there are. But there are different kinds of plants that are specifically adapted to the coast.
Okay. Okay. So now I know you've talked a lot about the different kind of plants that are in both the wetlands and the marshes and swamps. And what about the animals? What kind of animals?
Okay, that's a great question. So I'm going to tell two stories. I call these Louisiana success stories, and it starts in the 60s, before you were born, but not before I was born. So if I talk to you about the 60s, what in your mind, what are the primary things that you remember your grandparents talking about in the 60s?
In the 60s, ooh, Lord, I know there was a lot of, civil rights.
Yes, very much so.
There was a lot of going on, just if I'm thinking of the right time here, just a lot of general new thought and thinking and feelings and a push for kind of education and all of that.
Yes, very much so. So that was, if I look back on the 60s, the first thing I would think about is hippies.
Yes.
Right? So that goes with your ideas about new thought, new ways of thinking, and then finally the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Okay. As a naturalist now that I've studied for a couple of years, when I look back on the 60s, I see a time when we began looking for the first time at some of our native plants and animals and wondering what's gone on with them. And so the first Louisiana success story I'm going to talk about is the alligator, because in the 60s, what happened was that the alligator had been hunted for decades. And so hunters were out in the swamp and they were killing gators because this is beautiful. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, so this is an alligator skin. It's from a fairly young alligator, but the hunters would hunt the gators for the skin, and they did it without worrying about the population. And so they hunted and hunted and hunted until the gator population was really at risk of being, of diminishing until there were no more gators. And so in we're going to check real quick on the date, but they were placed on the Endangered Species list in 1973. So the Endangered Species list is a big list of animals, plants, many different things. And when the population gets down, we can put it on that list and it becomes protected in specific ways. And so we began to protect the alligator and study it very carefully. So we studied all kinds of things. We studied how many there were, we studied their nesting behavior, and we began to make a plan for how to let this animal recover. Do you think it recovered?
I hope so.
Yes, it recovered so much that I live on the Mississippi River, right there in New Orleans, and just over the levee in what's called the Batcher, there are alligators that live there.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. And if you go in any natural area around New Orleans, there are probably alligators that live there.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So the good news is that alligators are really not interested in you or me. Okay. They might be interested in your pet if it's a little furry thing, and the alligator might think, oh, well, that's my size, and it would go after your pet. But really, we as humans don't need to be afraid of alligators. We just need to respect them and respect their territory. And so from the 60s, we first noticed that their populations were decreasing. We began to put protection on them so that hunters could not kill every single alligator in sight. And so now, if you wanted to go alligator hunting, you would have to apply for a permit. And depending on the population that year, the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries would issue, I don't know, maybe 400 permits or 500 permits. But if there were fewer nests in a given year, they'd issue fewer permits.
Ah, okay.
So this is what we call a huge success story. And today, this is a great economic engine in the state, providing the leather, continues to provide the leather, and also alligator meat. Have you ever eaten alligator sausage?
I have had some alligator sausage.
Okay, so that's delicious. I think almost all of us would love some alligator sausage. So one of the important reasons that we wanted to preserve the alligator, yeah, it's for hunting, it's for people who make their living that way, but also because of the very special position alligators have in the swamp. They're what we call an ecosystem engineer. And so we know from living among people that we depend on each other, right? So I don't grow my own food, I don't create my own electricity. I depend on the other people in the community to provide those services for me. And animals are the same way. So the alligator has a special place in the wetlands because he's an ecosystem engineer, he or she. They build burrows in the mud, and during dry times, many animals come and, believe it or not, join the alligator in its burrow, especially during the winter when it's cold. So do you know what you call it when a bear gets very, very cold in the winter and he goes into his den and he sleeps?
He goes into hibernation.
Good, good. Well, a bear is a mammal. Alligator is not a mammal, it's a reptile, and so we have a different word for what the alligator does. It's called brumation.
Brumation.
He doesn't go into as deep sleep as a mammal would, but he is somewhat, he's gets real laid back because he's cold, right? And so he's real laid back in his burrow, and he really doesn't care if other animals come in and join him in his burrow while he's ruminating. And so he's happy there, and it turns out to be a great benefit to the ecosystem because he provides places for other animals to live.
I guess the animals just have to make sure they get out in time.
Right. And you know what? If a turtle or two provides lunch, you know, that's part of the food chain. So it's okay.
All right. So I know we've talked about the alligator, and I'm now thinking about just a lot of different animals. Thinking about the pelican also, our state bird. How are they a kind of a part of the ecosystem, the Louisiana ecosystem?
Good. Well, the pelican also dates back to the 60s. In fact, during the 60s, the pelican was declared the Louisiana state bird because we like, they're beautiful birds. But there were almost no pelicans living and nesting in Louisiana.
Oh, wow.
So this is the beginning of another success story, but there are many parts to it. So I'm just going to try to hit the high points of this story. So we, people, affect our ecosystem. We affect it a lot. And we did something for most of the 20th century in that we used pesticides very generously. Specifically, we used a pesticide called DDT. After World War II, this was considered to be a miracle because DDT killed mosquitoes, it killed the pests that were ruining crops, and everybody was excited. What we didn't know about DDT and a whole other class of pesticides is that they persist in the environment. They never go away. They don't degrade. So that DDT remained in the environment, and in fact, as animals in the food chain consumed other animals that had consumed DDT, it got more and more and more concentrated. Well, that was really bad news for the pelican because the pelican is at the top of the food chain. And so when the pelican began eating the fish that had come down the Mississippi River, it accumulated DDT in its body. Eventually, the DDT was in the eggs, and when it came time for Mrs. Pelican to lay her eggs, and she sat on the eggs, she's a bird that's about 4 foot tall, about so tall. Her wingspan is 7 feet. So,
wow.
Farther than from you to me, and she would lay 2 or 3 eggs and sit on them. Guess what? The eggs cracked.
Oh, no.
So the eggs that were laid from a bird that had consumed fish with DDT were very fragile. The DDT interacted with the shells and caused the shells to crack. And so all of the baby pelicans were not born. They died when the shells cracked for many, many years. And so we were in bad shape. So Louisiana had the worst problem with pelicans. There were still pelicans in other states. Well, when we figured this out, there were laws passed to stop the use of DDT by farmers and other situations. And so as the DDT decreased in the environment, we began to put pelicans onto our nesting grounds in the southern barrier islands of the state.
Okay.
Took a while, and there were other problems that showed up, but because we were watching and we were counting and understanding pelicans, we were able to get the pelicans to thrive. So your best way to see a pelican is to take the trip on the causeway from New Orleans to Mandeville.
Okay.
Have you done that recently?
I have not.
All right, so the next time you take a trip, don't drive, get somebody else to drive you. Look out the window, and the pelicans are flying along the causeway along with you in the car.
Oh, wow.
And their population has soared because we are careful about our use of pesticides, and we watch them. We try to understand what's happening as the population goes up and down.
That is truly another Louisiana success.
It is, very much so.
So what is a barrier island?
So a barrier island is an important component of our ecosystem, because all of South Louisiana is a delta. So a delta is the land that's formed when a river carries sediment and reaches the sea. In this case, it would be the Gulf of Mexico. So the Mississippi River for thousands of years has carried sediment down the river. It's reached the Gulf of Mexico, plop, the sediment falls out. Because remember earlier we talked about the salt water in the Gulf of Mexico and decided it was really salty? So the sediment carried by the river has a specific behavior, chemical behavior. When it meets the salt, it falls. And so those barrier islands are formed, and this is not a great visual, but I think it does show. There are these threads that form all along the coast, and these are called barrier islands. This is a dynamic process. Humans, we don't really think of the geology in our environment as changing, but it does. So you see a rock in your garden maybe, and you look at that rock today, and you look at that rock in 10 years, and it looks the same. But in geologic time, things change. And so these barrier islands that were formed change. They change a lot. In fact, there's a barrier island, Grand Isle. Have you heard of Grand Isle?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay, so Grand Isle is one of our largest barrier islands, and we've done a lot of work recently to maintain the integrity of the island structure. Every storm that comes through, we have to go down and make sure the integrity is still there. So Grand Isle is one of the barrier islands. Near it is another one called Elmer's Island. Near that is a place for, and I have a lovely photo of the pelicans. It's called a rookery. When birds get together to breed, that's called a rookery. And so we've got a rookery established on a barrier island called Queen Bess Island.
Okay.
And so that segment of the coast is important for animals, for plants. the real importance of, well, everything's important to me as a naturalist, right? But one of the big important ways that barrier islands serve is when birds migrate from the southern hemisphere up through Louisiana all the way up to Canada, they pass by our barrier islands. So those birds left Cozumel, I don't know, last night or the night before, and they're crossing the Gulf. The first thing they're going to see is one of our barrier islands. And they see green trees, and they see insects and birds and butterflies, and they fall down, take a little vacation on the island before they pick up and start flying on to Canada.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
That's, I'm sure, a very nice rest stop.
Yes, I'm sure it is.
Can you tell us if there's any way that any of our book club members can get involved?
Yes, so we're about to begin a junior Master Naturalist program. It's going to begin with kids in the 4th grade through the 6th grade. And so we're hoping to get that started in the fall. Those kids will study all of the kinds of things that we've talked about today, plants, water, soil, in a couple of different locations around New Orleans. And we're excited to get that program started for young kids.
Oh, wow. That sounds very exciting. Very exciting. Well, thank you
You're
so
welcome.
much for joining us today, Ms. Janell.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.